We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research, and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 16th of June 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
We will not have a second Holocaust, a nuclear Holocaust. We already had one in the previous century. Never again. We had to act now.
Benjamin Netanyahu gives a justification for the Israeli attack on Iran. We'll bring you the latest on the escalating situation. Cards to couture. We'll ask how transferable leadership skills are as the CEO of Renault may be heading to Kering. We'll have a flick through the papers and then check the lines coming out of the G7 summit in the Canadian Rockies. Then...
CEO Kelly Ortberg had surely hoped this event would be an opportunity to show the world Boeing's safety troubles were behind them. Instead, he has now cancelled his plans to attend.
No sign of Boeing leadership at the Paris Air Show. We'll hear who is there and what the latest investigations tell us about the Air India crash on Thursday. We'll have a hit of urbanism news from Zurich and catch up with Yael van der Wouden, the Dutch-Israeli winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Donald Trump reportedly vetoed an Israeli plan to assassinate Iran's supreme leader. That's according to US officials. A man posing as a police officer has been arrested for the killing of Minnesota lawmaker Melissa Hortman and her husband in what the state governor calls a politically motivated assassination. And thousands took to the streets in Barcelona and cities across southern Europe this weekend to protest over tourism, accusing mass travel of driving locals out and hollowing out city life. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, late on Friday, the Iran-Israel confrontation entered into its most dangerous phase in decades. Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, targeting Iranian nuclear and military facilities in Tehran, Isfahan and beyond. Iran struck back, unleashing missiles and drones on Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv and Haifa. Civilian and military casualties are mounting. Nuclear talks in Oman have collapsed. Tehran accuses the UN of indifference and behind the scenes has asked Cyprus, Qatar and Oman to mediate. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has called Israel's strikes excellent, but also hinted a deal with Iran is still possible. So can this be contained? Well, I'm joined now here in the studio by Burcu Ursulak, who is Senior Research Fellow, Middle East Security at RUSI, and down the line from Tel Aviv by the journalist Charlotte Henry. Burcu, there were fresh attacks overnight. Where do things stand now militarily? What's the scale of the escalation since Friday?
Well, the pace of escalation picked up quite considerably, with Iran vowing to severely punish the Israelis for the attack. The question now, of course, on a macro level, is the extent to which the Iranian side can sustain the impact and the scope of its retaliatory action against Israeli targets. There have been attacks against civilian areas or densely populated urban areas inside Israel in Tel Aviv, and there have been casualties and injuries reported. And this has had the effect of sort of a rather shocking effect on the Israeli side. The IDF had warned Israeli citizens to expect to be a difficult period ahead. And likewise, there have been civilian casualties reported in Iran as well. Mm. And I'm pointing to the civilian aspect of the dimension of the escalation, because this is where the trigger points for further escalation or miscalculation can really lie.
It's been reported that Iran's Revolutionary Guard said their latest attack employed a new method that caused Israel's multi-layered defence system to target each other. What's the detail on that?
It's difficult to assess very early stages now the credibility of these claims from the Iranian side. There were reports earlier this morning and overnight about Iran having launched precise hypersonic ballistic missiles, and this would be more difficult to intercept by the Israeli side. It would be potentially more damaging, more lethal. But again, at this point, it's difficult to assess without more sort of targeted sort of bomb impact assessments about what this actually entails. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of escalatory rhetoric on the Iranian side as to what might lie ahead. They earlier said as well that they are not open to negotiating under fire, and that they would not consider a ceasefire until their retaliation is complete.
Let's bring in Charlotte, who's on the ground in Tel Aviv. Charlotte, air alerts, damage, public response. Tell us what's going on there.
Hi, yeah. So I'm pleased that you guys mentioned civilians, and there was such an emphasis on that, because I think it's important to point out that this started, I'd arrived on Wednesday night. I was meant to cover the Pride celebrations here in Tel Aviv, because really I'm a culture writer, and so I was here to join the party. And then sort of in the early hours of Friday morning, was groggily woken up by these sirens, because Israel has targeted the military and nuclear capabilities of Iran, while Iran is intentionally targeting the civilian population, as you said, of Haifa, of Tel Aviv, where I am, and so on. I came out of the bomb shelter about, whatever it was, 4:30 this morning, local time, and there was lots of ambulances and police whizzing past. I think there was a hit pretty close to where I was staying. And so Iran is deliberately aiming at civilian populations here in Israel. And I think that's important to remember, to contrast with what the intention of the Israeli operation was.
Because Netanyahu actually made a direct appeal to Iranians. He said, "We're not fighting you." And he was invoking the whole women, life, freedom slogans. I mean, how is that playing in Israel? And are people behind the fact that this is probably a bid for regime change?
Right, it's such a great point. So I spoke to a couple of people, asking whether they were supportive of what was going on, because I was interested in the effect it had on their business, because everyone, as I say, I was here to sell for LGBT Pride, and there were streets lined with rainbow flags, and all the businesses were ready to be part of the party. And I spoke to a couple of them, and the consensus is that people are supportive of this action because they feel that the Iranian regime, and I emphasize the word regime because people were telling me that the people themselves of Iran, they have no problem with, but they felt under threat from that Iranian regime, which has time and time again made threats against Israel.
But if Netanyahu has claimed that Iran's nuclear program has been set back by years, do you buy that?
Again, it's very difficult to tell. We're early days, but when you consider the scale of the attacks, the targeting, the selection of the targeting, the scope, I think there is credible evidence thus far to demonstrate that Israel has created significant damage to Iran's nuclear program. The main uranium enrichment site, of course, has not yet been attacked, and the question here is, and always has been, does Israel have the military capabilities on its own without assistance from the United States to completely dismantle the nuclear program? And this has been a stated objective of Prime Minister Netanyahu from early April, when the negotiations between U.S. and Iran began, was that they were looking for a Libya-style full dismantlement of the nuclear program. Now there appears to be a sort of consensus that the program has been set back by several years. Then is this a moment where Israel might begin to be signaling that it's considering its exit strategy? Where is operational success achieved? When are those targets met? And then can we start talking about de-escalation and a potential ceasefire?
And as you say, the US involvement is very important. And we're hearing that some US intelligence figures weren't looped in ahead of the strikes. Is there daylight between Trump and his security establishment?
What's fascinating and also incredibly worrying is that there appears to be domestic divisions and fractures on all sides at the moment. And the extent to which the U.S. administration was in on what the Israelis were planning to do on the 13th of June when this new phase began, that has been debated. I think it's very unlikely that Israel took this step, this bold step to attack on such a broad scale with multiple targets, a diverse range of targets. And we're not only talking about the nuclear program. I think it's really important to note that Iran's senior military command structure and the IRGC commanders have also been killed in Israeli strikes. And so this attack on the command and control structure, the decision-making modes within Iran's military forces and intelligence, I think is hugely significant. Would this level of attack, this coordinated, multi-layered attack, or campaign rather, would this have taken place without some U.S. coordination? I find that quite unlikely. But again, of course, there are mixed reports, unverified reports. There seems to be a sense that that the U.S. and Israel may have played sort of behind the scenes and publicly sort of bad cop, good cop, and that President Trump has been publicly stating at least that he sees a path towards a nuclear deal still. The diplomatic door has not yet closed on Iran, provided that Iran agrees to dismantle its program or not enrich uranium, not have a bomb, variously stated by the administration.
And finally, what about the risk of contagion?
The risk of contagion is something that bears very heavily on the minds of analysts. For the time being, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has said that the situation appears to be under control and with a low to no risk. But again, this is very much contingent on the path of escalation and whether the U.S. joins Israel in strikes against Iranian sites that are deeply underground in fortress-like installations. And so would that create an escalated wave of contagion risk? Perhaps, but again, it remains to be seen at this point.
Bertu Osalek, Senior Research Fellow, Middle East Security, RUSI, and Charlotte Henry, a journalist in Tel Aviv. Thank you both for joining us. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Luca De Meo, the man credited with reviving Renault, is now reportedly heading to Kering, the group behind Gucci, Balenciaga and Saint Laurent. It's an unexpected shift from car factories to fashion runways. But it comes at a rocky time. Kering's had a bruising year. Gucci's underperforming and sales in key markets like the US and China are down. So what does De Meo bring, and can he steer this luxury giant back on course? Well, I'm joined now from Zurich by Monocle's editorial director and chairman, Tyler Brûlé, and also by Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Teodosi, in London. Good morning to you both. Tyler, what's your reaction to the idea of an auto industry CEO taking over a luxury fashion group? Does that kind of crossover make sense?
Good morning, Georgina. It was a bit surprising, but I think it is a shrewd move. I've met Mr. De Meo in the past. He's had a very, very good career. You could argue a rather glowing career in the automotive sector, and in many turns at the top end. He was at Audi, he was at Seat under the Volkswagen group, and of course, of late, since 2020, he has been at Renault. It's not been a long run, but it's been a very good run at Renault. Very good results for 2024. Not a bad margin either at a very challenging time of course, for the auto industry, not to mention the French auto industry. And you can see, I mean, you look around, there's been a proper turnaround of the Renault brand, and not just the core brand, also other subsidiaries, other marks that they own at the same time. So, and I think, as you said, a rocky time for luxury right now. Many of the big groups scratching their heads, figuring out where they need to go. So bringing Luca Di Maio in, I think, is probably just the right thing for this time.
Natalie, what are the potential pitfalls of hiring someone with no fashion background?
Good morning from me, Georgina, as well. I think I agree with what Tyler is saying. It's a really interesting move because someone without a fashion background can really come in with a fresh perspective. I think the fashion industry does have so many unwritten rules that if you're working in it for years, you just follow without questioning them. And he could just come in with an external perspective and rewrite the rules and rethink the business model of Kering. But of course, when you don't have the industry knowledge, you don't have the connections, a lot of it is based on relationships and personality. You have to work with all these big creative directors. There's also the risk of how you're going to settle in.
Tyler, Francois-Henri Pinault is stepping down as CEO, but staying on as chairman at Kering. Does that feel like meaningful change or just more of the same?
No, I think that this is probably something that had to happen. He's probably realized his own operational limitations, so stepping up or just remaining in the chairman post probably makes considerable sense. And he needs someone who's in the thick of it day to day. Luca Di Maio, he's a marketer. He's someone who understands brand, and that's exactly what Kering needs right now. And of course, this is a far-reaching group. You're looking at of course, you need a turnaround right now at Gucci. Mr. Di Maio, of course, understands the culture of Franco-Italian companies, culture, business. It's exactly, I think, what is needed. We see Bottega Veneta hopefully in the ascent again. A very strong campaign that they've just launched, but that's not enough. I think the other interesting thing, though, about the group, and like so many of these groups as well, Pinault's interests also span into media. Through his Artemis holding, he also has Ponant, one of the big cruise companies. So the portfolio that Mr. Di Maio is going to touch is considerable. And having someone, and we have to always remember as well that this probably in the background, Renault is probably held, I think 15% of Renault is held by the French state. Of course, Kering is an independent company, but it's incredibly important to France Incorporated. So as so often the case, Georgina, in France, these things just don't happen by accident, or at least not without the Élysée knowing what's going on. So I think that they see, of course, Kering as a bit of not just a bit, it is a jewel in the crown, of course, of France Incorporated. So making sure you have the right person at the tiller is absolutely essential.
And Natalie, Tyler has pointed to these major shifts already underway at Gucci, at Balenciaga and at Bottega. What are the big creative and commercial challenges ahead for Di Maio should he take the role? As we know, it's not yet 100% confirmed.
I think he will have to work with this new wave of creative directors that have been hired, but also you need a leader who will oversee all the brands and put the brands first, no matter what the creative directors propose. I think a lot of these brands, what they're missing now, especially in the case of Gucci, it's continuity. They've been changing their logos, the storefronts, very drastically again and again in the last few years. So someone like Di Maio should come in with a very clear vision and connect the dots and put the brand first and kind of invest in their signatures despite what the creative director will bring, because that's, again, another gamble that might or might not work. So you need a real leader who will kind of establish a foundation no matter what.
And Tyler, a final thought from you. If this works, are we going to see more of this type of move, CEOs skipping sectors and strategy taking precedence over insider knowledge?
It could be, because I think, as Natalie said, this is it is a time of upheaval, I should say, for the industry. It could be a bit of a marker. Of course, we've seen musical chairs, of course, at LVMH. at Chanel. Hermes, maybe you could argue, is a bit more stable at the moment. I think one of the interesting challenges is going to be, and Natalie, it'd be great to get your reflection on this, if not now, maybe in an op-ed piece, is also, there's a whole layer, Georgina. Of course, we always talk about the creative directors running the maisons, but also above them, oftentimes, and you have presidents of divisions as well. Here you have a very, very strong leader suddenly coming in the shape of DeMeo. Are you going to see more of a situation where you have creative directors potentially answering to him? And maybe, and this could also be a cost-cutting move as well, are you going to have as many powerful presidents? Of course, you're still going to need leadership and brand leadership, across Bottega, across Gucci, etc. But could it be a weaker type of leadership where suddenly DeMeo is actually calling more of the shots? You have more elevated managers looking over those brands as opposed to people who are in these presidential posts. And I think there's obviously a cost situation as well. As I said, it's incredibly expensive. Sort of the ego of a creative director coming in, changing logos, changing shop designs, etc. This will come under probably greater scrutiny when you have someone like DeMeo in charge.
Yeah, and Tyler, just before you go, talking of CEOs skipping sectors, you tempted by anything in particular?
I'm personally no, but I'm fascinated to just see what this does. And I said, it's really a fascinating exercise, an example, Georgina, of how France Incorporated can be very much in lockstep with government guidance. And it wouldn't surprise me if some of this, started to cook up, in the garden outside the Élysée.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Monocle's editorial director and chairman, Tyler Brûlé in Zurich, and Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Terdosi, here in London. Now, still to come on the programme.
I don't know if grief sparked it immediately, but it was the desire to escape grief that definitely propelled it forward.
That's Yael van der Wouden, winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction, who's speaking to me about her debut novel, The Safekeep. This is The Globalist.
Craft is a matter of perspective, a unique outlook, an obsessive attention to detail. With UBS House View, you get the big picture in bite-sized articles, delivered daily and curated by over 200 globally connected, locally active analysts, all focused on identifying the latest investment opportunities and market risks to help you achieve your financial goals. UBS, banking is our craft.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me in the studio is Charles Hecker, author and Russia analyst. Zero Sum is the title of his book about the international arc of business in Russia. Charles, I could ask you how your weekend was, but I can tell you because I was with you for much of it. And here's the thing, while we were sipping rosé in the sunshine in the gorgeous courtyard of the British Library during the Jaipur Lit Fest in London, this first story that we're going to discuss actually pinged up on both of our phones at the same time. And this is the very shocking political assassination, as it's been called, in Minnesota.
That's right. And we're going straight to the New York Times with a wrap-up of breaking news, and that is that 48 hours later, after an extremely tense manhunt that was the largest manhunt in the history of the state of Minnesota, a suspect has been arrested in a double murder and double attempted murder with political underpinnings in the state of Minnesota. And Vance Bolter, who is 57 years old, has been arrested and charged with multiple offenses. The New York Times paints quite an interesting picture, first of the operation to find him, which scoured the state and found leads as he fled from the scene. He was discovered armed, but surrendered voluntarily when confronted by police. And, you know, this individual has quite an unusual background. He, for a while, worked in the agricultural business. For a while, he worked in the food service business. Most recently, he's been running a security company and was providing vehicles that looked very much like the sorts of vehicles that Minnesota State Police use in their daily routines. And we know that one of the reasons why he gained access to the politicians that he assassinated in Minnesota is that he was impersonating a police officer. And so now, the investigations will carry on and the charges will be filed and he'll be held, and we'll see where this goes next.
Yeah. Now, of course, some of the people he targeted were taking place or about to go and take part in the No Kings March, which was this big, big protest over the weekend, just saying we don't need an emperor, we don't need a king. The only king we worship is Martin Luther, etc., etc. And this march taking place at almost exactly the same time as this huge military parade, which it was meant to be for the army's birthday or the military's birthday, but incidentally also happened to be Trump's 79th birthday. I mean, this was on the scale of the sort of things that you'd expect from North Korea.
Well, exactly. I mean, I'm sure it was entirely a coincidence that this military parade took place on the president's birthday. This was exactly meant to be one of these sort of North Korea type events, or one of these sort of Red Square kind of military parades. The Washington Post, where we're looking at the moment, is just full of stories kind of about the mopping up in the aftermath of the parade, including an op-ed asking whether was Trump's military parade a success. And Georgina, I suppose this really depends on what you want to accomplish. The coverage has been various. Some people found it underwhelming. Others found it quite impressive. The consensus about whether the parade is a success or not seems to focus around the fact that it provided Americans with a much-needed history lesson, and that is because there were lots of people marching in period costume for various wars that the United States has been engaged in, including the Revolutionary War. So if nothing else, while tearing up the streets of Washington, D.C. with tanks, if nothing else, the parade delivered a little bit of a brush-up on American history.
Absolutely. Well, let's turn to British history, because historically it has always been a man that's headed the intelligence service here. Finally, MI6 has a woman in charge.
That's right. Big, fat, lots of ink in the headline here about Britain's MI6 spy agency promotes Q to be the first female head. And of course, Q will now become C to be the head of Britain's external spy agency. The new head of the agency, MI6 or SIS as it's more formally known, is Blaise Metrowelli. She was formerly, up until her immediate promotion, she was the head of the technology division of MI6. And so she was in charge of technological innovation, and she was in charge of all of the gadgets, the sort of things that you might have seen if you're a fan of James Bond movies. She has a very, very interesting background. She's a career spy. She worked at MI5 as well, where she was in a division called K, so she has quite an impressive alphabet. Behind her, she's a fluent Arabic speaker. She's of Georgian heritage and extraction, and has worked abroad, including in war zones. So not only does the UK have its first female spy chief, it's got a very, very experienced career espionage professional at the helm.
She's also got a sort of great glamorous spy name, hasn't she?
Yes, Blaise Metrowelli. That's going to trip very, very well off the tongue. She's the only person, the head of MI6, is the only individual in the organization to be named publicly. So if we ever hear a name, it's going to be hers.
Absolutely. Finally, dog birthdays and parties.
Now, Georgina, I didn't really choose this story entirely by accident, knowing that you are a dog owner, but there's a piece in the Times today that it says, Rise of the 120-pound birthday party for pets. And so the Times tells us that, first of all, there are 22 million pet owners in the UK, and 2/3 of them are spending hundreds and hundreds of pounds, up to collectively £1.7 billion, to throw their dogs birthday parties. The gifts are becoming increasingly expensive and extravagant, and I guess I really kind of want to throw this back to you, Georgina. You have a gorgeous spaniel called Bella. What's her birthday party like?
She doesn't have one, Charles. I am not guilty of this. Now, her birthday, I do know when it is. It's the 9th of May. She recently turned 10. And I did tell her it was her birthday, and I did allow her to go for an extra long swim on Hampstead Heath on that day. But she doesn't get parties. I spend quite enough on vet bill and food and all the rest of it.
Should you choose to spoil Bella further, Georgina, you could buy her a plush grey cushion with her face on it for £25.95, or you could have a 4-piece coaster set with her picture made for £14.95. Just a few different things that you can throw in Bella's direction when she turns 11.
Well, she already has a very expensive animal print dog bed with memory foam, so there you go.
Pampered pets indeed.
Charles Hecker, author and Russia analyst, thank you very much indeed. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Donald Trump reportedly vetoed an Israeli plan to assassinate Iran's supreme leader, according to US officials. The revelation adds a dangerous new layer to the Israel-Iran standoff playing out on the sidelines of global diplomacy. A man posing as a police officer has been arrested for the killing of Minnesota lawmaker Melissa Hortman and her husband in what the state governor calls a politically motivated assassination. The attack has shocked the US political establishment and triggered a national outcry. And thousands took to the streets in Barcelona and cities across southern Europe this weekend to protest over tourism, accusing mass travel of driving locals out and hollowing out city life. Demonstrators armed with water pistols and anti-tourism slogans say enough is enough. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It is 7:29 here in London. That's 23:29 in Kananaskis. The G7 returns to Kananaskis in the Canadian Rockies 23 years after world leaders gathered there post 9/11. This time it's Donald Trump stirring tensions with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney vowing to push back. But with China racing ahead in Africa, the US pulling back on aid and global alliances under strain, can the G7 still lead, or is it just bracing for impact ahead of NATO? Well, I'm joined now by Paul Rogers, an Open Democracy's international security expert. Paul, it's always a delight to have you on the show sharing your insight. How does Donald Trump's presence shift the tone and focus of this summit, and what steps have been taken to keep the meeting on track and not hostage to Trump's theatrics? Have they Trump-proofed it?
They've done their best, but things are being thrown into a bit of a mess by what is happening in the Middle East. And I think this is really, they're probably changing agendas almost as we speak. A couple of things I think are worth mentioning at the start. This is, the 57th of these G7 meetings. They've been going on for a long time. They started right back in Rambouillet in France, I think back in 1975, something like that. One interesting thing about this one is that Carney has invited quite a lot of other foreign leaders. Key ones include Mexico, India and Saudi Arabia, but also Australia, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, South Korea. They all have their leaders invited and most will be going. So to some extent, this is a meeting of the sort of market economy states, more or less generally. Obviously, Russia is not included, China isn't included, and some others as well, and major states. But it's a big gathering. Now, maybe that Trump-proves things a little bit, but I'm really not sure. The other thing I think one has to say at the start is, although the signs are early, the war between Israel and Iran is not going quite as expected. The Iranians are getting more of their medium and longish range missiles through this extraordinary defensive screen. And remember, that screen includes a key American facility actually controlled by American personnel in the Negev Desert in Israel. So essentially, that, I think, is going to strain things. And however much Carney obviously wants this to be good as far as Trump is concerned, and perhaps try and talk him into some of the issues on all the sanctions problems, it's going to be difficult to do because the situation in the Middle East is changing almost by the hour at the present time.
Now, it's been reported that Carney's decided to ditch the final communique. Does that signal realism, or is it a loss of faith in G7 unity?
Well, put it this way, I think it is possibly a loss of faith, but it is reality. I mean, essentially, if you get a communique from this group, including Trump, it's going to be extraordinarily bland. And so the better thing is to say, no, we're not going to have a final communique, but a lot will come out. And of course, that will be fed out primarily by the Canadians, but also with the other key delegations, particularly the United States, having their own views on it. So it's going to be complicated. Having said that, it may well be that there is some progress made. What it does do in these sorts of events, a little bit like the General Assembly meeting in New York of the UN every September, October, you get lots of conferences and meetings going on the side. Now, this is only a 2 to 3 day conference, which is different. But of course, you've got a selection of countries here that are important. Having said that, again, Trump is such an unknown player that you simply don't know how he's going to react. The Canadians will be working very hard to keep this sort of sweet and rosy, but you simply don't know where that's going to be possible. I'm sorry I'm sort of uncertain on this, but I think this is the reality of what we face. This is an extremely unusual meeting of the G7. I can't remember something like it almost since it started, but that's where we are now. And I think Carney, who is a very skilled political operator and can be very tough, one tends to forget that, he may well have one or two tricks up his sleeve. He's talked to Trump, he's met him personally. And if I remember rightly, I seem to remember that when he was in Washington, he did not go for a major press conference in public with Trump, because he knows how those can go wrong. So we've got a very smart operator here on the Canadian side, and to that extent, we may find that the things are a little bit smoother than expected. But that may be more because all eyes are going to be on Israel-Iran. And as I say, what's happening there is not going quite as expected.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, Ukraine, trade, climate, excuse me, all of that is going to come up. But one interesting thing that has been flagged is the rise of Africa. I wonder how seriously the G7 is engaging with the continent beyond just talking points.
Well, apart from South Africa, there isn't a representative of the continent in a whole. And that is, in a reflection of it, is not yet taken hugely seriously. One other factor, of course, which is glaringly obvious, is that many of the key G7 countries have been slashing their own development programs, their own aid programs. And this really is reducing the significance of the G7 across the global south, and certainly with the likes of many African countries. So that is something that's going to be handled pretty difficultly. It's not something that Carney can deal with very easily. And of course, this is something where Trump, frankly, is just not interested. And the American foreign aid program has been slashed almost to nothing.
Well, exactly. So with that US aid in retreat, is Canada ready to lead on global development?
Well, I mean, it's such a small economy, a huge country, but a smaller economy. It doesn't have the capacity to do that on any large scale, but it could actually begin to change things round. I mean, in quite a number of Western countries, including Britain, there's been sort of real dismay at the way that the aid budgets are being cut. I mean, in the British case, it's a double whammy in that, you know, the aid budget was cut under the Tories and almost exactly the same amount of money was fed into defence. And the surprise, I think, now among many Labour supporters in Britain is that that has not been changed, that Britain, if anything, is even tougher. So, yes, there may be domestic support for improvement in aid programmes, which may have an effect. But that comes back to your point, and that is that it would take Canada to do this. And if Canada has some sort of statement to the end pointing to the significance of this and how the G7 really has to count on this, then that might do some good. And that's one area where somebody like Carney may well play on it because he has all this experience on international development as well as everything else.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. That's Paul Rogers, Open Democracy's international security expert. This is The Globalist. Well, it's time now for a look behind the headlines. Here, Monocle's Paris bureau chief, Simon Bouvier, tells us about the Paris Air Show, which begins today.
Today, the Paris Air Show, officially named the Salon International de l'Aéronautique et de l'Espace, took off at Le Bourget Airport just north of the French capital. As the oldest and largest salon of its kind, the fair has long been the marquee event of the year for both commercial and military aviation. On the commercial side, the crash of the Air India Boeing 787 Dreamliner in Ahmedabad will mean aircraft safety is once again front and center, much to the dismay of the U.S. aeronautics giant. CEO Kelly Ortberg had surely hoped this event would be an opportunity to show the world Boeing's safety troubles were behind them. Instead, he has now cancelled his plans to attend. It's a bold decision from a CEO who has got a lot right since taking the helm last summer, but many of Boeing's key clients will be wondering why it has decided not to show face in an industry and era where optics are key. Despite the Ahmedabad tragedy dominated commercial conversations, this year's edition of the Paris Air Show is perhaps the most crucial for defense-centric aeronautics firms. Europe is undergoing a seismic shift towards what French President Emmanuel Macron calls strategic autonomy, and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has bluntly dubbed independence from US military assistance. With trillions of euros pledged to defense spending across Europe in the years to come, all eyes will be on Le Bourget for hints on what the future of military aerospace in Europe will look like. How will the industry adapt to a huge increase in demand? How can firms outside of Europe be a part of this historic rearmament effort? And will current leaders cement their dominance, or will new players meet the moment? We'll be on site to find out.
That's Monocle's Paris Bureau Chief, Simon Bouvier there. And you can hear more from him live at the Paris Air Show on The Briefing at noon London time. And for more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, do sign up for our free daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute, at monocle.com/minute. And now, listening to that with me here in the studio is London-based aviation analyst Sally Geffen. Sally, let's just pick up where Simon left off, Boeing's decision not to show up at the Paris Air Show. What kind of message does that send to the industry?
I think that to the aviation industry, that sends a dual message. One is taking account of this devastating event, this incident with the Air India air crash. And I think that is appropriate, actually, because aviation is a global village. It's very competitive, but also, given Boeing's checkered history on safety, it shows that he's doing due diligence on that front because he's prioritising working with the Indian authorities on the actual investigation. On the other hand, of course, this would normally be, I say normal, but prior to the crash, this would be a time for him to really lead from the front with, all flags waving for Boeing, because it was coming out of its troubled times. It has been coming forward with greater profitability and commercial prowess than before. So it's literally a fork in the road, and he's taken that choice, and it's obvious why.
Yeah. Now let's just get the latest lines from the investigation into Flight 171. Are there any early signs from the black box data? Are we any closer to knowing what happened?
Well, on the weekend, it's been confirmed that the second black box has been found, and it's still incredibly early days because, first of all, they have to process that box and access the forensic data, and we don't know whether the Indian authorities will choose to make that open and clear to the wider public, or, segue it into the major investigation. We can expect at the end of the first 30 days a preliminary report, and then usually at the earliest, a full year from then, a fuller report. So, yes, the other thing, of course, is that the government of India has decided to carry out inspections on, has ordered Air India to carry out inspections on its Boeing 787 fleets. And also Japan has also asked its airlines operating B787 fleets to inspect them. But the US contingent, unsurprisingly, the FAA and Boeing have made stringent denials that at this stage there's anything to indicate there's a flaw or a fault with the Boeing 787. Of course, we saw with the 737 MAX crash back in 2018, 2019, that many airlines, there was a domino effect and they started to ground the 737 MAX. But there isn't the same level of, we don't know what is the cause of the accident, but there's nothing to indicate at this point that there's a global need for grounding the 787.
Well, I mean, and that's the interesting part, is because, of course, the aviation regulators, as you say, in Japan, but also India, have ordered more checks. But crucially, they haven't actually grounded the fleet. I mean, that surely suggests confidence in the model, which I think has been flying since 2011 with a very good safety record.
So no hull loss has been recorded. In other words, none of the 787 aircrafts have been involved in loss of life or major injury. However, there were some teething problems in the early days when the 787 entered service. There were some concerning battery issues and battery fires that were contained and didn't cause any further problems. Also, a couple of whistleblowers were concerned about the way the aircraft was put together. But you're absolutely right, Georgina. It is a workhorse of the skies. It's a very modern, fuel-efficient aircraft. We don't know what the actual cause of this crash is, and there's nothing to indicate at this point in time there's anything defective with 787.
Thank you very much, Sally. That's the London-based aviation analyst Sally Gethin. You're with Monocle Radio.
There's a craft to every question, which is why at UBS, we query every aspect of the market, working with specialised experts and award-winning research teams, covering over 3,500 stocks in 50 countries, all delivered in a comprehensive library, answering what you want with what you need. UBS, banking is our craft.
Well, it's time now to talk urbanism with Jessica Bridger, who's a journalist and consultant on urbanism and a regular Monocle contributor. She joins us down the line from Zurich. Jessica, lovely to speak to you again.
Yes, nice to speak to you, Georgina.
Right, so whose right to the city? Tell us about participation and the involvement of citizens and the public in urban matters.
So participation is something that has been discussed within urbanism circles for a long time. And there was a recent paper by the former New South Wales Minister for Active Transport, Rob Stokes. He's a planner, and he was calling out many of the issues, such as whose right is it to participate? When should they participate? How much influence should each citizen have? And who should decide who gets to say something, how much they get to say? And when is public participation best applied in the life cycle of urban projects? And interestingly, Stokes points to kind of the downsides of participation. So when regulatory gridlock and special interest or minority opinion issues create roadblocks for larger community and societal needs. And the issue is that many times participation ends up being used to block local developments that actually might have a regional impact that is a positive thing for far more people than the smaller objections more locally. And that's something that I think we're seeing is kind of the kickback to a lot of things that were happening in the early 2010s into now, where participation was just seen as a universal good and was even slapped onto projects no matter when, just to say that participation had happened.
And that's something, of course, we unpick a little bit more in our annual Quality of Life survey, which is coming out very soon. And speaking of that survey, let's look at a couple of elements of urban environments that seem small but have a huge impact. And one of those is street trees.
Right. I think that street trees are one of those things where people look at the city around them and they understand kind of the broad brush elements. And it's when you start to understand the finer grain and the smaller elements that I think we get a lot more out of our cities, and that we as citizens can be more active in the way that they are built, the way that we look at them. And street trees are a key element in cities. And they're something that create a lot of positive elements, whether that's significant health and well-being impacts, filtering pollutants, and increasing biodiversity in cities. So urban street trees are something that we don't actually look at, but they tend to be a palette of trees that's remarkably consistent in climatically similar cities, because urban conditions for trees are really specific and really challenging. They have to tolerate high soil compaction, drought, vandalism, limited maintenance. And as climate change increases the pressure on our urban street trees, planners and landscape architects are starting to look at which trees really thrive in the urban environment as drought increases, as urban temperatures increase.
Of course, the London plane is the one that we see most often here. I grew up with jacarandas everywhere. What's mostly on the streets of Zurich?
So in Zurich, there's a really good tree mix, and there's also plane trees. There's no jacaranda, sadly, but there's a range of trees that are suited to the environment. And, we have areas like Europa, LA, where we've seen plantings of ginkgo that actually don't do well. So there's an ongoing analysis of which street trees thrive in which areas, and how do you set up trees to be in a situation through manufactured soil, through all kinds of kind of built means, and also through maintenance to ensure that they have longevity. So there was a study in Australia that really looked at which trees thrive particularly well. And as you mentioned, London plane is a tree that globally is a favorite. It towers over streets. It's very robust. It's, the most common street tree in New York. It's incredibly common in Sydney. It's common in London. We have them also all throughout the urban environments in Switzerland. And, it's these trees that create such a positive impact. Mexico City wouldn't be Mexico City without the jacaranda. But it's also that kind of smaller scale, just putting street trees on a street that didn't have them before has significant benefits that are well far-reaching and have a lot of wellness impact on individuals' lives. And street trees live decades.
Let's have a look at another small but important thing, which is balconies, terraces, and porches.
So this is, I think, a Monocle favorite because they contribute so much to urban life, whether that's just the value of greeting your neighbors from up on high, the kind of that public and private interface that balconies, terraces, stoops all provide, or just when balconies are planted, it again contributes to that kind of greening on the street, those public health benefits. And the social life of balconies is something interesting. So the Polish filmmaker Paweł Luzinski just released his balcony movie, which was shot over 2 years in Warsaw. And the premise was simple. The director tried to engage passerby in interaction about the meaning of life from the balcony. And if we look at how balconies and how porches in the American context influence and create a threshold of the individual and collective, and that's from the curator's statement of the American Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale, looking at the porch and how it provides kind of a democratic and public space, which is actually on private territory. So one of the most interesting aspects of that exhibition at the Venice Architecture Biennale is a contribution from Places Journal, where they put together a library of books related to the idea of the porch, recognizing the importance of these quote unquote threshold locations where private shades into public, and reading about that from incredibly broad perspectives from 19th century planning all the way until planting manuals for your, local balcony or terrace.
Do you have a porch?
I have a balcony, which I actually just recently purchased a new table and chairs for.
Well, I'm hoping that you're going to have a very, very happy summer out there on your sunny Zurich balcony. Thank you very much to Jessica Bridger, journalist and urbanism consultant, speaking to us from Zurich. And if you're looking for a sharp and considered ranking of the world's most livable cities, well, Monocle's annual Quality of Life survey will be out in our July-August issue, and that will be available on newsstands later this week. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. The Women's Prizes took place late last week in London, celebrating women's writing. This year's winners were Rachel Clark for non-fiction with The Story of a Heart, and in the fiction category, Yael van der Wouden for her debut novel, The Safekeep. I caught up with the Dutch-Israeli writer Yael and asked what sparked the idea for the novel.
I don't know if grief sparked it immediately, but it was the desire to escape grief that definitely propelled it forward. I was grieving my grandparents, who had died very recently, within a few days of one another. And I was looking for something in my brain to escape to. What I used to do as a kid a lot is I would play movies in my head in the VCR machine, and then I would play usually 101 Dalmatians, and I would start at scene 1, and I would just play it through until I fell asleep. But I memorized it, and that gave me huge comfort because I could just turn on a movie. And I would do that with most movies that I would watch over and over again. And then eventually books. And then eventually my own little stories that I would then escape into.
You talk about the difference between novels and short stories, but of course this is your debut novel. And so, I mean, had you written other novels?
Oh, yes. Listen, I think it's very important to for everyone to hear that no one just wakes up one day, starts writing, and then writes a debut that is, first of all, 70K, and second of all, feels like it's like that is not, that's, I don't think, I mean, it might happen. And if it does happen, I will be incredibly impressed and I will eat my own hat. That's what they say in Dutch. I will eat my hat.
They say it in English too. How would you actually say it in Dutch?
Is that correct?
Yeah.
No, it's the other way. Your shoe in Dutch.
And say that to me in Dutch?
Ja, dan eet ik mijn schoen op. Dan eet ik mijn schoen op. That's how they say it. That's the lilt.
That's the lilt. So as you say, I mean, it very, very rarely happens.
It rarely happens.
You'd experimented with the form before.
Oh, yes. I'd started writing novels that never came to anything. I had written a novel, and it was a large novel. It was such a large novel that I thought it was going to be 4 separate novels. And then all my friends were like, that's not a way to debut. And they were right. So I tried to make it into one novel, and it was a massive sort of 140K, and it was sprawling 4 different perspectives. It was a heavy, loaded novel that I wanted to feel light, and there was no way of making it feel light. There was too much in it. I wanted it too badly. And then I got the idea for the Safekeep, and I thought, oh, wouldn't that be nice? Just one perspective, one house, one season, contained. And I had endless conversations, specifically with one friend, Talia, and I would just be like, I would be miserable about it because I didn't want to admit that the other one didn't work. And I honestly cried about it quite a lot because I was like, I spent 3 years of my life writing that. What if it's not it? She was very good at never saying that novel was not going to be it. She said, what if it's, it could be both, and it doesn't have to be the one or the other. And she coaxed me and coached me into writing The Safekeep, which I'm endlessly grateful for.
And it's done so incredibly well. I mean, just the Booker nomination must have been life-changing.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, people kept asking, what does this mean to you in this point in your career? And I was like, what career? I was born 3 seconds ago. What are you talking about? No. Yeah, it was bizarre, and this is bizarre. And I'm very grateful for the Booker because I don't know if I would have been able to handle this if I hadn't been prepped by the Booker. Because the long list went on 2-3 months after the publication. And so I went from being terrified that my baby, my book, was not going to do very well and that no one was going to read it because that's, those are your fears and that's what you're thinking the whole time, to suddenly being like, oh no, what if people do read it? And what if people do either like it or hate it? Sometimes both of those can feel very daunting. And then people did, and then that was scary too. And then, suddenly thrown into the mix with these giants of literature, and I felt very young and very small and terrified. And I was also moving apartments, and it was my birthday, same week. It was a lot. But I mean, what an honor, obviously.
Yeah. This is a British prize. Is it something that has a lot of traction at home? Do people recognize the Women's Prize?
I mean, I've been following the Women's Prize for years. When it was the Bailey's Prize, when I was studying, and I studied comparative literature, like you said. So it was definitely part of the conversation of what got longlisted, shortlisted. It was a conversation of like, why can't these books be on the syllabus? Why can't we read them as part of the... Yeah. And then I became a teacher, and then I realized how difficult it is to get a book on a syllabus. And then I had a lot more sympathy for my teachers. I've been an avid reader of the recommendations for years. If you're especially a reader of English literature, which many people in the Netherlands are, you will be aware of it. Yeah.
What is the literary landscape like there?
It's small, and most everyone knows each other, but it's also quite inspiring because you do get to lean on each other quite a lot, and you get to speak a lot, and you see each other at every single event. When people talk about the London literary landscape, it sounds a lot like in the sense that it's small and contained. But it's where, it's my friends, it's my family, and it's brilliant people.
That was Yael van der Waarden, author of The Safe Keep, winner of the 2025 Women's Prize for Fiction. And you can listen to Yael and the non-fiction winner Rachel Clark on this week's episode of Meet the Writers, which you can get from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers Monica Lillis and Chris Chermak, our researcher Francesca Gilks, and our studio manager Mariella Bevan, with editing assistance from Steph Chungu. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and the briefing is live at midday from Dufferstrasse 90 in Zurich. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.